is to celebrate the extraordinary career and achievements of Vincent Gillespie, FBA, FSA, FRS, Hist S, FEA, Emeritus J.R.R. Tolkien Professor of English Literature and Language here at Oxford University. Born in Liverpool, educated at St Edward's College, he did his undergraduate degrees in English and graduate study here at Keble. He lectured at Reading University from 1977 to 1980. He was a tutorial fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, the college with the largest quota of English students, from 1980 to 2004, and then became professorial fellow of LMH on being elected the third Tolkien professor. Vincent is an honorary fellow of Keble and St Anne's and a senior research fellow of Campion Hall. Probably the finest student of English at Keble ever, certainly of the medieval period, without question. Vincent is a very close friend and my closest cancer buddy who I speak to 2 or 3 times a week. His courage and fortitude is an example to us all. I wish I'd arrived 3 years earlier at Keble and read English and had Vincent as a travelling companion, or even been taught by him when I read English at Oxford second time round, as opposed to the gin in the teacup and, how can I put it, strong criticism that I received instead. That I received instead from one of his erstwhile colleagues. Vincent, it is a huge joy to be here, and we all look forward to hearing your thoughts. So, the title. The Poetic is naturally... Title. The Poetic is naturally attracted by the mystical. What lies beyond and hidden inspires writers to compose songs of the threshold, perpetually gazing, gesturing towards the unknowing and parsing the unsayable. The poet can reach deeper into the mystical than the philosopher or the theologian. I studied both here. Logic and philosophy, for example, has an intellectual drive such that you are either right or wrong according with logic, or you've crossed the line and you're a don't. To reach into the mystic, you have to abandon this constriction, leave logic, rationality, and instructions behind. Theology, especially amongst the major religions, with a clerical or priestly hierarchy, demands obedience and observation. And again, that is something very challenging indeed. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, has some of his writings taken to form a religious orthodoxy, which deemed non-compliant in the views, which if you disagreed, you were deemed to be non-compliant and therefore heretic. G.M. Hopkins feared that his poetic vision went beyond orthodoxy and never published in his lifetime. Robert Bridges fortunately published him posthumously. William Blake of Jerusalem, The Songs of Innocence and Experience, was unrecognized in his lifetime, and it took a biography published posthumously in 1863 by Alexander Gilchrist, but it really took until the 20th century for William Blake's genius to be recognized. He deeply disliked the church and any organized religion. He was an English dissenter or separatist, a Protestant Christian separated from the church of the 17th and 18th century. He particularly disliked any union of organized religion when it was allied to government. Dissenters breaking the 5 Mile Act risked a £40 fine or 6 months in prison. So he was under threat, you could say. It's been suggested that Blake's spirituality is a form of mysticism grounded in the imagination as a mode of perception and a belief in the apocalyptical union of contraries that occurred through the life and death of Christ. Free of religious and government restriction, William Blake's able to write unique poetry. So we've discussed several poems, Vincent and I'm going to read 1 or 2, and Vincent's going to interrupt and correct me when needed. and observe. So we're starting with Henry Vaughan, the Silurist. The World, verse 1. I saw eternity the other night like a great ring of pure and endless light, all calm as it was bright. And round beneath it, time in hours, days, years, driven by the spheres, like a vast shadow moved in which the world and all her train were hurled. The doting lover in his quaintest strain did there complain. Near him his lute, his fancy and his flights, wits, sour delights. With gloves and knots, the silly snares of pleasure, yet his dear treasure all scattered lay, while his eyes did pour upon a flower. So Henry Vaughan, the Silurist, again, I think he, for me, metaphysical poets are a rich source of mystical insights, and Henry Vaughan makes the link between the word metaphysics and the hyperbole argument in his case, that several friends by sympathy can join, which clearly isn't technically possible if they're not in the same place.
The interesting thing about that, if I may interrupt, is that the collection is called Silex Scintillans or Scintillans, which means the sparking flint. And what Vaughan clearly sees his poems as doing is providing these sparks of insight, these sparks of imagination, these sparks of perception that will set fire to the imagination of the reader, and so they're not meant to be, as it were, self-reflexive purely about his own circumstances. They're meant to be putting a spark to the tinder of the imagination of the people who encounter it along the way. And I think that's a fascinating insight into the way that the broader metaphysical movement sees the world reacting to the poetic impulse in particular ways. Sorry.
No, for goodness sake, that's what we're here for. I'm very much feel the role of an undergraduate reading an essay. It is good in parts. Next, we're going to go to William Blake, The Songs of Innocence and Experience. Fascinating man, not educated, left school, trained as an engraver, wound up at the Royal College, but started as an artist, and then became, I think, a considerable writer, but obviously he had to keep his political views to himself. So we'll start with one from Innocence, and it's the laughing song. It's pure, unbridled, and constant joy. When the greenwoods laugh with the voice of joy, and the dimpling stream runs laughing by, when the air does laugh with our merry wit, and the green hill laughs with the noise of it, when the meadows laugh with lively green, and the grasshopper laughs in the merry scene, when Mary and Susan and Emily with their sweet round mouths sing, ha ha, he, when the painted birds laugh in the shade, where our table with cherries and nuts is spread, come live and be merry and join with me to sing the sweet chorus of ha ha, he. And then the world, that's the world for me as he imagines it should be and he'd like it to be. He lived in London, and I think of all the poems about London, this is in many ways the starkest. London. I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Incredibly grim, isn't it? I mean, the contrast. Sort of one half of the book, innocence, and that's what he finds in Providence.
Extraordinary.
It's very, very powerful. Next up, the Wind Hover by G.M. Hopkins, which is a truly extraordinary poem and poet. The Wind Hover, to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple-drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level, underneath him steady air and striding high there. How he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy. Then forth on swing, as a skate's heels swings smooth upon a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuff the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act, oh, air, pride, plume, here buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee then, a billion times told, lovelier, more dangerous. Oh, my chevalier! No wonder of it. Sheer plod makes plough down Cillian shine, and blue bleak embers are, my dear, full gall themselves and gash gold vermilion.
It's interesting, isn't it, how much of the kind of hermetic vocabulary of mysticism is actually in that poem. I mean, just the first line, I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin. It's an aperçu, it's something that just grabs you, right? It's something you see in a moment. And then he goes on to talk about ecstasy and the idea of ecstasis, of going out from the self, which is so fundamental to the contemplative experience. And then he says, my heart in hiding stirred for a bird. That's a difficult one for someone from Liverpool to say, stirred for a bird. But that the heart in hiding, that sense that there's a part that is being moved by this experience, or by the event, actually, not the experience, that makes it stir. But it's the deepest, most parts of the hiding heart which are being moved in that way. So he's really, there's a profound theological understanding there of the nature of the unforeseen nature of the poetic effect, the way poetry gets under your defenses, the way poetry can take you somewhere that you don't expect it to, in the way that his sudden vision of the bird has taken him somewhere he didn't expect to. I think it's really powerful as a metonym, if you like, of the broader experience of contemplation that Hopkins would have been trained in. And, you know, at the point at which Hopkins was being trained in theology, of course, Aquinas was absolutely the most powerful figure in Catholic theology. So that sense of what goes beyond the rational, what goes beyond the logical, what goes beyond the analytical, that is so characteristic of the Thomas of the Summa Theologica, puts you in mind of the event late in Aquinas' life where, I mean, there are two interesting things about Thomas Aquinas. There are lots of interesting things about Thomas Aquinas. Though I did once know an Irish Dominican who was prefect of the Vatican Library, a wonderful man called Leonard Boyle, who said to me, as a Dominican, you'd think he'd be a fully paid up member of the Thomas Aquinas fan club. And he said to me, Thomas Aquinas is never the answer to any question worth asking in the Middle Ages, he said, which I thought was rather a bold thing for a Dominican to say, I think. But Aquinas, the other thing that's interesting about Aquinas is that he was reputedly able to dictate 3 works simultaneously to scribes in different parts of the same room, and that he could keep the line of thought going in each of the 3 works. The reason why he dictates is apparent. If you've ever looked at the Thomas Aquinas autograph, there is a page of Thomas Aquinas' handwriting that survives, and it is completely illegible. I mean, it is unbelievably difficult. It make your average GP look like a child's primer. It's ridiculous. So I can see why he dictated rather than wrote it out longhand himself. But the anecdote that ties in with that is that sense of going beyond the system, going beyond the logic, going beyond the analysis, and efflorescing into something more powerful is borne out by Aquinas late in his own career, where he had a vision while he was celebrating Mass, very late in life. And he said to one of these scribes, who were no doubt waiting with their quill for the next rational analysis, everything I have written is as so much dross compared to what I have just been shown. And that sense that you know, Aquinas, the supreme rationalist, the supreme Aristotelian analyst of theology, who became the official theologian of the Catholic Church during Hopkins' lifetime, was actually shown the au-delà, shown the beyond, shown the limitation of his method and what was there beyond and above what he'd been able to achieve through his own analysis. And I think Hopkins captures that so beautifully. I think that sense of efflorescence, that sense of going beyond, that sense of, I mean, it's not accidental, I think, that in the Middle Ages, one of the words used to describe contemplative events was raptus, that somebody was rapt into heaven, which is the same word as rape or abduction, famously and ambiguously in the case of Chaucer's law case, whether it meant abduction or whether it meant physical assault. But that sense of being carried away, being suddenly liberated, which I think is fundamental to the contemplative event, but also fundamental, I think, to a lot of poetry in the way that it works in producing what the French would call the jouissance, that sense of the efflorescence of understanding from something which is a series of stimuli rather than a process along the way. I think Hopkins is extraordinary in the way that he captures that, actually, and the humility that he recognizes of how those flashing elements suddenly come through in when his heart is open to be moved by it in that way.
Do you think there's a slight sort of frisson of fear and also a slight feeling of sort of being alienated or very distanced from that life? Because, you know, later he describes himself as time's eunuch. It's as if he's sort of slightly scared, maybe that the teaching he's getting and what he's writing in his poetry are very contradictory. And he, you know, he's chosen a life of contemplation around that light of action, and maybe there's just bits coming through, you know.
It's a particular paradox. It's a particular paradox for Jesuits, because Jesuits claim to combine the contemplative and the active lives in an unusual combination. And I think that in his case, as somebody who'd been a parish priest in a very working class part of Liverpool, who'd worked in Oxford, who'd been a high grade student, those elements are clearly in tension against the sense of just wanting to be open, wanting to hold himself open for what is going to be shown. And I think we'll see as we go through, one of the things that's most central to this idea is partly the idea that the poetic can open you up to unexpected insights, unexpected showings, but also that it can encourage you to go on journeys that take you into unmapped landscapes that you're not able to comfortably navigate with your usual tools.
We talked about this, and we were very cognizant that the finest poet of Keble has produced is the late Sir Geoffrey Hill, who Vincent and I knew well, and so got a poem here written by Geoffrey Hill, which I think is again germane to the cause. History is poetry. Poetry as salutation, taste of Pentecost's ashen feast, blue wounds the tongue's atrocities. Poetry unearths from among the speechless dead, Lazarus mystified, common man of death. The lily rears its gouged face from the provided loam, fortunate auguries, whirrings, tarred golden dung. A resurgence, as they say, the old laurels wagging with the new. Selah! Thus laudable, the trodden bone, thus unanswerable, the knack of tongues. Had a few things going.
Absolutely, yes. My go. Okay. Right, sorry, I think I've already had my go, but never mind, I'll have another go. There's a lovely story about Blake's wife, a great visionary poet, and she once said to his young friend Seymour Kirkup, "I have very little of Mr. Blake's company. He is always in paradise." And I think that sense of somebody who, as it were, is sending postcards from the edge, is sending dispatches from the beyond, is something that a lot of poets actually see themselves as performing and doing in different ways. I think the fundamental aspect of this is, I've touched on already, it's learning to travel hopefully through an intellectual and imaginative terrain that you're unfamiliar with. I mean, we don't read poetry to find reflections of ourselves. We read poetry to be taken somewhere different. Hopkins talks in one of his dark sonnets about the mind having mountains. The mind has mountains. About the terrifying psychic geography that he's having to navigate in his struggles. And my absolute favourite Middle English poem, Middle English lyric, the first line is, "In a valley of restless mind." That sense that there are psychological landscapes that poetry can take you into, and that they can leave you in the middle of a landscape that you're not familiar with, that you don't know how to navigate, where you have to travel hopefully, where you have to follow the clues, where you have to allow your imagination and your instinct perhaps to have more freedom than your reason or your analytical skills. Now, the problem with poetry and mysticism, poetry and contemplation, is that, I mean, the word mystic, which is not much used before the Renaissance, literally means hidden. And so we're talking about something which is not easily accessible, not easily available to people. It's at the extreme of people's understanding. And I think that's why thinking about mysticism and poetry brings you into a lot of current debates about the psychological nature of literary response. In particular, there's a lot of work being done at the moment, for example, on attention and the nature of attention, the way that people's attention is fostered and developed. In a way, this is going back to a very old model of what was called faculty psychology, which in the Middle Ages analysed the different ways in which aspects of one's understanding were formed by different engagements with knowledge, or with the emotions, or with insight, or with intellectual analysis. And there is a debate going on about the way that emotional response and intellectual response work together to create a deeper level of understanding, a kind of intellection that actually is the result of the firing of the sparks of these two different modes of knowing coming together and producing this resonance, this efflorescence in different ways. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is most poetry that engages with contemplation being about a process that brings you to the threshold of what's happening, the threshold of contemplation, the threshold of understanding. It's not possible to describe the contemplative experience as a genuine phenomenon. So these are what you might call songs of the threshold. These are things that are moving you away from your standard left brain, ratiocinative, analytical, discursive consciousness into a more intuitive right brain modality. And if any of you have read any of Ian McGilchrist's work on the left and right brain, you'll know that in his most recent big book, this enormous book called The Matter with Things, there's a long, long chapter right at the very end of volume 2 where he talks about the nature of religious experience and the nature of contemplation, which is not the same as religious experience. And the reason why I say it's not the same as religious experience is that actually the word experiencia, the word experience, involves a process of analysis, already involves a process of analysis. You can have a contemplative event, you can have something that takes place on the event horizon of a mystical showing. But the minute that you start thinking of it as an experience, it has chronology, it has linearity, it has duration, it has texture, and therefore it's already begun to be processed. It's being dragged back into left brain analysis. And the point is that poetry is almost always dominant on the right brain rather than on the left brain. It's much more a sense of that as a process. I mean, McGilchrist says, understanding poetry depends heavily on the right hemisphere of the brain. And that's the part of the brain that intuits, that makes leaps of association, that is associative, that is profoundly imaginative. When I was an undergraduate, Malcolm Parks, of blessed memory of this college, used to set an essay on Langland, on Piers Plowman, and he would say, the essay question was Langland a systematic or an associative thinker? And it's a very, very interesting question, because when you're writing a poem over many thousands of lines, of course there's an element of system involved, but the kind of imaginative association that Langland's imagination played with, the way in which ideas concatenated, was in fact much more associative than it was analytical, probably because he wasn't taught in the scholastic environment of the academic schools. He hadn't been to university. He might have been taught in a monastic school, which would have had a more holistic, more kind of affective way of thinking about it. But these poems are about, a lot of these poems are about bringing you into the kind of gap between what the cloud of unknowing calls the cloud of forgetting and the cloud of unknowing, that there's a kind of empty space that empties you of expectation, empties you of analytical presuppositions, and leaves you waiting for whatever might turn up, whatever might show along the way. I'm very struck by Julian of Norwich in her Revelations, and in particular two things. There are two big manuscripts of the long text of Julian of Norwich, who had these revelations between 1373 and about 1413. Both manuscripts derive from the 16th century. There are no medieval witnesses of the long text. And one of them has clearly been worked over by a Counter-Reformation intelligence because it's shot through with analytical theological language. So, for example, I'll give you two examples, and they both feed into this general sense of travelling, hopefully, of being prepared to embrace the unfamiliar. There's a point in the long text where Christ says to Julian, "Attend to me." And in one version, the version that's been worked over by the Counter-Reformation theologians, it's "intend to me." Now that might not seem like much of a difference, but it's actually a ginormous difference, because intention involves projection. It involves a trajectory of thought, whereas attention involves holding yourself ready without an agenda, without an understanding of where you want to go. It's the word that Julian calls beholding, which is that you simply put yourself ready to be shown whatever will come. So attend is what I think Julian probably wrote. Intend is what the theological reworker thought she should be doing, because she should be yearning in a theologically appropriate way. And there's a further example which is even more powerful, I think, which is where she says, quite early on, she says, "It is God's will that we seek him to the beholding of him." This is the Sloane manuscript, which I think is the one that captures Julian's actual thought. God's will that we seek him to the beholding of him. So that there are two movements there. It's the sort of thing that in rugby would get the try disqualified. There's a second movement involved. There's the seeking, but then there's the beholding, which is where you don't have an agenda. You don't go in with a series of expectations or demands or projections or whatever it may be. Our Counter-Reformation theologian changes that and says, it is God's will that we seek into the beholding of him. Now that's what theologians do, but it's not what a contemplative does. You don't seek into the beholding of God. You, as Julian says memorably on many occasions, you wait to see what you're shown, and then you can bring it back into your understanding through a process of analysis. Now, there's a way in which, because of these songs of the threshold, they're really just gesturing into the ether. They're gesturing into the darkness. There's a kind of inbuilt aporia. There's an inbuilt gap in the performance of these things, which requires what theologians would call kenosis, the process of self-emptying. The biblical antecedent of this is Philippians chapter 2, which is the great kenotic hymn where we're meant to put on the mind of Jesus. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, analytical left brain, but emptied himself and humbled himself, becoming obedient even to death on the cross, for which cause God hath exalted him. Now you've got there not only, I think, the basic parabola of Christian life, but actually the basic parabola of contemplation. You don't grasp. You empty yourself, you're humble, you're obedient, you wait to see what happens, and that leads you to being transfigured, leads you to being transformed through the process. And sometimes you get poets who actually dramatize this process, but in a way that actually leaves the gap in the middle. I'm going to read you a little bit of Old English. I will translate it, but I want to read it in the Old English first of all. This is from the Old English poem, The Seafarer, one of the great Exeter Book elegies. For thon no min hudja chweafeth over chredder locan, min mode safer mid merafloda, over whiles ethel, weoveth wieder eoth and shatas. Kimeth ef to me, yifra and greidig, yilleth anfloga, wheteth on whileway, chretha unwianum, over Homer ulagu. Now, what I've just read you is the middle 8 lines, literally, numerically at the center of the poem. I mean, the poem splits precisely in the middle of those lines. And what it says is, now my mind journeys beyond my body, my spirit across the mere flood, over the domain, the homeland of the whale. It journeys wide across the surfaces of the earth. That's the midpoint. It comes again to me, eager and unsatisfied. The solitary flyer yells, urges out onto the journey, unresistably, the spirit over the waves of the sea. Now, I don't know whether you can see what's happened there, but he's talking about an ex gessus mentis. He's talking about an out-of-body experience, a contemplative experience. But whatever happens at the end of the journey isn't there. There's just a gap in the dead numerical center of the poem. And then the spirit returns to the body. Cometh ef to me, yifra and greidig, eager and unsatisfied, because it's only ever transient, it's only ever passing. And the more you see, the more you want. And so that sense that you have in that wonderful, wonderful poem is of the soul going out from the body in a contemplative flight, being shown something, coming back in a transfigured way. And in fact, what's interesting is that the rhetoric of the poem after the return of the soul is very different. It's much more relaxed, it's much less anxious, much less needy, much more able to see the pattern in the diversity of human life. So that seems to me to be a fascinating case in very early literature where you get the gap. I mean, we could have called this Mind the Gap, couldn't we, really? It would have worked well as a session along with anything else. And I think that sense of minding the gap is something which I think a lot of poetry, not just religious poetry, but a lot of poetry is obsessed with. It's about taking people onto these imaginative journeys. And let's look at a couple of examples now. There is if you look at the Ephraim the Syrian, first of all, which is pretty extraordinary, actually. Ephraim is writing in the 4th century from the heart of the Syriac church and writing these extraordinary hymns of faith, where in this particular one, in hymn 31, he starts talking about the way that God uses language and images and words to leave the trace of himself. And this is all it is a trace. It's a trace, it's a bit like laying a trail that you can follow. So you've got the version from the recent translation by Geoffrey Weeks. Let us give thanks to him who has put on the names of body parts. Let us understand, if he had not put on the names of these very things, he would have been unable to speak with our humanity, with what is ours. He drew near to us. He put on our names to put on us his way of life. He borrowed and put on our form, and like a father with children, he spoke with our childishness. And then he undoes that in the next verse. This image of ours he put on, yet he did not put it on. He stripped it off, yet he did not strip it off. Putting it on, stripping it off, he put it on as an aid and stripped it off in exchange for another, stripping off and putting on every image. He taught that none were the image of his essence. Though hidden is his essence, he depicted himself through revealed things. Now, that sense of the paradox is obviously fundamental. There's a great 15th century theologian, Nicholas of Cusa, who wrote a treatise called On Learned Ignorance, De Docta Ignorantia, who comes up with a concept of what he calls the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. And there's a sense in which what Ephraim is doing here is creating a matrix of paradox, which is one of the ways in which you can suspend your left brain analytical rationality. That if you have to be able to sustain both sides of a paradox simultaneously, it creates almost a kind of chink in the wall of reason that perhaps allows something to penetrate through. Remember the wonderful Leonard Cohen line, everything is cracked, that's how the light gets in. I mean, Cohen is a mystic, he's a contemplative, absolutely understands the nature of the way these processes work. And I just want to, I've given you the modern available translation, but I want to read you a little bit of an earlier translation by the great Sebastian Brock, who was one of the scholars who brought Ephraim into modern understanding, where he talks particularly about this hymn as about God adopting the garment of names. That in fact it's like the incarnation is putting on a whole series of verbal identities, a whole series of utterances. And Sebastian's translation is slightly different from Weeks's, and I think in some ways it's more audacious, I think it's bolder. He says, he clothed himself in our language so that he might clothe us in his mode of life. It is our metaphors that he put on, though he did not literally do so. He took them off without actually doing so. When wearing them, he was at the same time stripped of them. He puts on one when it's beneficial, then strips it off in exchange for another. The fact that he strips off and puts on all sorts of metaphors tells us that the metaphor does not apply to his true being, because that being is hidden. He has depicted it by means of what is visible. I think using metaphors rather than images is absolutely inspired there, because this is the point about poetry as a metaphorical mode of discourse. It's like asking yourself the question, what is the difference between simile and metaphor? Right? A simile adopts a causal, linear relationship. X is like Y. It's not surprising that Shakespeare says, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. He wants to deny simile. He doesn't like. Metaphor is much more gestural. Metaphor is much more imaginatively challenging, isn't it? It simply says, in a strange way that I'm simply not going to explain to you, you can think about this as being a bit like that. And that's where the geographical landscape, that's where the imaginative landscape comes in that you have to navigate. That's where you're being dropped somewhere and saying, work this out. How does this work? How does this operate? So that the poet is taking you on a journey from reason through to a mode of affective understanding that is somehow beyond analysis, beyond reason, beyond perception in some fundamental way. And if you look at the other handout that you've got, the very first poem on there, which is Herbert's great poem, Prayer 1. I just want to point your attention to the last two words. the journey of that poem is towards something understood. It's towards a deeper, higher level, not of knowing, but of wisdom. Now, if you think in terms of psychology, if you think in terms of the difference between things that you know and things that you understand, there's something to do with processing, there's something to do with experience, there's something to do with having felt it yourself. Sapientia, the Latin word for wisdom, had this wonderful etymology, entirely false etymology in the Middle Ages, which says that it came from sapor, which means to taste. And therefore they called sapientia the savoury science, the science that comes from having experienced it, having tasted it for yourself, having somehow internalized it, not just known it. I know that there's somewhere called Australia, but I've never experienced Australia. That's a different mode of knowing. And so there's a deep, deep poetic understanding here of the different phases of intellection, the different phases of processing of knowledge into understanding along the way, and the efflorescence into wisdom, into the savoury science along the way. The other thing I'd draw attention to in the Herbert prayer, if I just rattle through it quite quickly, is the way that it actually operates. This is a poem written in the early 17th century. There is no argument. There's no linearity. This is a series of propositions that are just being allowed to jostle and spark against each other. And any one of the ones that captures your imagination, it's there for you to take and to work with. You don't have to follow it as a sequence. You don't have to assent to it as an argument. You simply go with it as a series of propositions. Prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reverse thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear, the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear. That's a wonderful line, isn't it? Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manner, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, land of spices, something understood. It's like something you'd find in Coleridge's notebooks. It's a series almost of observations, of propositions that are not turned into anything that's analytical or sequential or linear or chronological or propositional. It just is avoiding anything to do with what you might call the left brain. But the language is constantly tugging you towards the idea of the beyond, towards the idea of things that are exalted, things that are heaven in ordinary. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement. I think that's an amazing ability to articulate the sense that what we're dealing with here is a mode of perception. Now, one of the favourite tricks of the Middle Ages commentators, the exegetes on Scripture, was to talk about what they called the multiplex modes of Scripture. The point about Scripture was that it had loads of different modes of representing itself. So you had, without sounding too much like Pandarus, you had the historical, you had the chronicle, you had the moral, you had the hortatory, you had the poetic, you had the revelatory, you had the prayerful, and so on and so forth. And they would assign the different books of Scripture to those different modes. And the poetic modes of Scripture were recognized as working by metaphor, by analogy, by image. We're talking about books like, of course, famously the Book of Psalms and the Song of Songs. Books that, I mean, you know, you have to work quite hard to make an erotic love poem like the Song of Songs into an allegory of Christ's love for the church. So you talk about it as being the poetic mode, if you like. You talk about it as the multiple modes of Scripture. But I think it's more than that. I think the point is that Scripture works in lots of different ways to bounce you into different levels of understanding. I once, when I was in Berkeley once, I went to a lecture by Robert Alter, who wrote a famous book called The Bible as Literature. He was introduced, he was very old at that point, he was introduced as the man who wrote the Bible because he actually translated the Bible into modern English. But Alter's great perception, and I think this is a fundamental perception, which I think maps in some ways onto the Herbert. His great perception was that the mistake that most Bible translators make is that they decide on a register of language and they apply it throughout the entire Old and New Testament. So if you think of the committee that did the King James Bible, they chose a high-style register, they chose a set of terminologies, they chose a set of vocabularies, and they simply wheeled it out. What Alter says was, if you look at the Hebrew Bible in particular, almost every line is playing with a different genre, playing with it. It's a reference to a different kind of poem. It's moving from lyric to satire to history to chronicle. It's constantly unsettling you. It's constantly playing with your expectations. So rather than being this kind of monovalent drone of a register, it's unsettling in all its different respects. In other words, it's moving you away from the ratiocinative, away from the linear, away from the chronological, away from what's going on in that respect, because it's always something that lies beyond. It's always an exercise in language which is compromised. It's very hard to talk about this subject without talking about T.S. Eliot and the quartets. But the way he describes his struggle with language is particularly powerful in East Coker. That was a way of putting it, not very satisfactory, a periphrastic study in a worn-out poetical fashion, leaving one still with the intolerable wrestle with words and meanings. The poetry does not matter. It was not to start again what one had expected. Exactly. Poetry is never what you expect. What was to be the value of the long looked forward to, long hoped for calm, the autumnal serenity and the wisdom of age? Had they deceived us or deceived themselves, the quiet voice elders, bequeathing us merely a receipt for deceit? There is, it seems to us, at best only a limited value in the knowledge derived from experience. The knowledge imposes a pattern and falsifies, for the pattern is new in every moment, and every moment is a new and shocking valuation of all we have been. Boy, does that man know the way poetry works. And of course, earlier on, he says, words move, music move only in time, but that which is only living can only die. Words after speech reach into silence. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness. And that sense of the gesture, that sense of the movement into the stillness and into the silence. So the second poem on your handout, the Rilke, I just want to talk briefly about that. Happy are those who know behind all words the unsayable stands, and from that source alone the infinite crosses over to gladness, and us, free of our bridges, built with the stone of distinctions, so that always within each delight we gaze at what is purely single and joined. We build bridges made with the stones of distinctions, right? But the point is that the revelation is whole, it's entire, it's out of time, it's a flash of what might be understood. So that moving on to the R.S. Thomas poems, Thomas is the, I'm going to finish in a moment, Thomas is the great poet of the apophatic, the great poet of the unsayable. He was a Church of Wales priest, remarkably misanthropic, I think it would be fair to say, much more interested in the life of the mind than he was in other human beings. But the way he talks about the via negativa, the negative theology, the absence of presence, although it's a nagging absence for him, is, I think, very powerful in terms of the way the poetry works overall. The Via Negativa poem is I think, one of the greatest of his works. Why, no, I never thought other than that God is that great absence in our lives, the empty silence within, the place where we go seeking, not in hope to arrive or find. It is God's will that we seek him to the beholding of him, as Julian said. He keeps the interstices in our knowledge, the gaps, right? Not knowledge, but the gaps between the knowledge. That's where the light comes from. The darkness between stars. His are the echoes we follow, the footprints he has just left. We put our hands in his side, hoping to find it warm. We look at people and places as though he had looked at them too, but miss the reflection, as though metaphor. So that, again, there's a deep understanding there of the way. If you look on the next page, I won't read the whole Threshold poem, but the thresholds are what I've been talking about. I've been talking about the way poetry brings you to the threshold, where you have to hold yourself, waiting for some signal, waiting for the it's a bit like having a radio telescope, waiting to pick up that signal from beyond. And it's interesting where he says in that second stanza on the next page, what balance is needed at the edges of such an abyss? I am alone on the surface of a turning planet. What to do but, like Michelangelo's Adam, put my hand out into the unknown space, hoping for the reciprocating touch. It's that sense of being open, that sense of being moved out of what you expect, moved out of your comfort zone, moved out of your carefully constructed rational world, that poetry and theology at their finest can achieve together. And the poetry of this kind is articulating the way that actually it moves you to a point where there is that jouissance, there is that explosion, there is that sudden efflorescence of understanding, at which point I should stop. Thank you. Actually, I haven't stopped. I'm going to say one more thing, sorry.
You're going to mention
which
Jeffrey
is,
Hill, aren't you?
well, I was going to mention Jeffrey Hill, but I also want to mention the other Ephraim poem, the poem on the pearl, which is also on that sheet. Just so that you can look at it later on. He writes 5 hymns on the pearl, and the pearl is a recurrent phenomenon. There's a wonderful Middle English poem on the pearl. There's a whole modern series of ruminations on that Middle English poem. The reason why Ephraim thinks of the pearl as opposed to another kind of precious stone, and the reason why he's seeing it as being cognate with, if you like, the biblical pearl of great price, is that pearls don't refract light. They don't reflect light. They're not like a diamond. They diffuse. If you shine a light through a pearl, it diffuses. And so what Ephraim is talking about in the pearl is precisely the oblique metaphorical way that poetry seeks and theology seeks to explore the nature of God along the way. So it's a really interesting set of poems, and that I've just given you one example there to play with later on. Right now I have genuinely finished.
No last word on Geoffrey.
Well, Geoffrey, on the last handout, the Geoffrey poem is interesting because it's from Funeral Music, one of his great early sequences. And what he's basically saying is, let's play a mind game. Let's have a thought experiment. If mind is more precious than soul, where does that get us? And where it gets us is a myth of captivity. As he says, Averroes, old heathen, if only you had been right, if intellect itself were absolute law, sufficient grace, our lives could be a myth of captivity, which we might enter, an unpeopled region of ever new fallen snow, a palace blazing with perpetual silence, as with torches. That's not meant to be some paradisal landscape. That's a fantasy world that we've created from our own minds, from our own intellects, if you like. If you'd been right, if intellect itself were absolute law, then ratiocination could create this stasis, this stillness, this snapshot, something that looks a bit like the opening of a Disney cartoon or something. Whereas the whole point about contemplation is that it's a process, and it's a process which is evanescent. It's a process which is fleeting and which is complicated. So in a sense, the thought experiment is a very Geoffrey thing to do. Let mind be more precious than soul. It will not endure. And that's absolutely right, because the ratiocinative world that we construct for ourselves will always come a cropper. It will always fall apart along the way. So dear old Geoffrey got it right. That's what one might imagine.
We've just got time, and I've asked the two third-year theology scholars to pop up with a question each. So, Quenta, do you want to go first, and then William after that?
Well, I just generally want to... And thank you very much for such beautiful and fascinating words. On? Okay. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on mysticism in nature. And Robert McFarland has kind of recently been exploring, you know, the way in which we can kind of find that reconnection within nature, but also how, in reference to kind of the nature writers of the 20th and 21st century of, you know, Nan Shepherd or John Muir, sits in opposition with what we have now, where mastery has usurped mystery. And I think that a lot of the core of mysticism is the mystery that lies within it. So I just wanted to ask you.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think if you wanted to, you could borrow the phrase rewilding to describe the imaginative process that reading poetry is encouraging. It's trying to get you out of the well-tended, neat environment and to deal with. I mean, of course, Aquinas would say that, you know, one of the 5 proofs of God's existence is the trace of God in nature, and there is a long theological tradition of reading God in the world. I mean, there's a wonderful Donne poem, isn't there, on the cross, where he says, wherever you look, you see the shape of the cross. But there's also a sense in which what they're doing there is exploring the way in which that's one phase, which is experiential. But when you've banked that, you've got to move on. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because otherwise you end up with pantheism. And pantheism is representational, whereas true contemplation is not. It's ultimately imageless. I mean, God is, you know, as the Cloud of Unknowing says, God can be loved but not thought. We all know what that feels like. We all know what to love something is, but you might not be able analytically to put it in mind. So I think that certainly a respect for and admiration of nature is an important element, and I think we have become deracinated from that. And actually, McGilchrist would say that all goes back to the Enlightenment. That sense in which the ordering, the maestry, the mastering of the natural world that you found in the Enlightenment was part of the supremacy of the left brain and the diminishing responsibility or diminishing admiration for the or space for the right brain to operate. Sorry, you were going to come back.
No, I was just going to say, I read recently someone was kind of describing it in terms of an obsession with kind of Gnosticism in nature, of just having full understanding and knowledge in that mastery of it, and losing the mystery.
I think it's coming to the borders. I think you've got to come to the border, and then you've got to stand there waiting. I mean, there's a great 14th century mystic, Richard Roller, who has a whole series of lyrics where he's basically standing on the waterside, waiting for the call, and saying, "How long will I have to wait?" Well, the answer is, maybe always. I mean, there's no guarantee that the bleep is going to come. It doesn't stop you from having telescopes pointing out into deep space to see what can be signaled, what can be picked up.
Thank you.
Thank you again. It's an honour, as always, to hear you speak. I think you and I would agree that the figure who stands behind all of your discussion this evening, both on the Western and the Eastern side, is Pseudo Dionysius, who inaugurated this via negativa and this apophatic approach. It's a common polemical suggestion of the Christian East that the via negativa tradition that proceeds from Dionysius in the West lacks one key philosophical ingenuity that the East has, which we've briefly discussed before, the essence-energies distinction, which allows the Eastern Dionysian tradition to make propositional statements about the disclosures they've received apophatically. So there's no contradiction for the East in making propositional discussion of non-propositional information that they've received by way of negation, because what they're talking about is the energies and not the essence. And as I understand it, that's exactly the problem that Ephraim touches on in this poem time and again when he says, inquire into the sea, which is the kind of repository of symbols, but not the lord of the sea itself. I feel like you're uniquely well placed to assess the Dionysian tradition in the West. How do you feel about that Eastern accusation? Do you think it leads, on the one hand, to a kind of anesthesia that you get in John of the Cross, say, or on the other hand, to an excessive analogizing and psychologizing? What would you credit or discredit that suggestion?
It's a 5-minute argument or the full half hour. As a kind of yeah, definitely. I think there were two. I think you've got to think in terms of two kinds of negative theology in the West. One is the hardcore Dionysian stuff, which is propositionally self-cancelling. The superabundant negativity in the way that the Latin versions of Denis the Areopagite are presented. What then happens, which is the second tier, is that negative language starts being used itself metaphorically and bolted on to what is basically a cataphatic way of thinking about theology, so that you end up with a hybrid in the West, which is cataphatic. That means it uses images for most of its intellectual and affective development, but only at the very highest level does it shift into the negative mode. And that is a kind of hybrid, impure form of negativity that I think allows things to be deduced, if you like, at an earlier point. So if you look at Julian, there's a chapter in Julian of Norwich where she parodies negative theology. In I think rather amusingly. I think she's quite clearly doing it because she doesn't do it anywhere else. All of a sudden, everything is this and not that for about a chapter and a half. But then she basically says, and then God said to me, such and such. And so there is a propositional quality there. But the propositional quality in the West comes from the cataphatic tradition, not, I think, from the Dionysian tradition.
Thank
Thank you.
Two great questions, and I hope that both of you, once you've done the rigours of finals, will carry on following those two fascinating paths that we both outlined, and maybe after my days, but it would be in the future, I think you'll both wind up sitting with Vincent and I. Sorry, I'm almost moved to tears. This has been a very, very special evening, and for anybody that wants to look and think further, I can recommend the Cambridge Companion to Medieval English Mysticism, which Vincent wrote in, co-authored, co-edited, and has written in immense depth and quality. It's been a very special evening for me, and I hope for all of you. It'll go up on the website, but I feel we've had a very special and unique evening, and for that we must thank my extraordinary and great friend Vincent.
Thank you.